suggested by the fact that we're approaching the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. These last few years, the last years of the 1990s, are a sort of a season of semi-centennial anniversaries. The reason's obvious. World War II marked a very significant turning point in human affairs. The industrial societies were mostly destroyed. The U.S. economy prospered during the war. The U.S. ended the war in a position of extraordinary power. It had about half the wealth of the world, incomparable military power and security, and naturally it used this power to attempt to organize the world, to construct a new world order, which in fact really deserved the term. It's now half a century. We can look back and ask how it's fared. The New World Order of the late 40s was based on three fundamental building blocks. One was an international economic order, what's called the Bretton Woods system. A second was an international political order, of which the foundation is the United Nations Charter. And the third was a set of international norms for the behavior of governments toward their populations. That's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So what I want to do is review where these stand, what's happened to them, what it suggests for the future, and I'll focus primarily on the third, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Well, the Bretton Woods system is often described as a system of liberal internationalism. Actually, I've described it that way, but that's not quite correct. The intent of the founders of Bretton Woods, Harry Dexter White, the U.S. negotiator, and John Maynard Keynes, the British negotiator, their intent was partially to create an international liberal order. They intended to try to liberalize trade, but at the same time to regulate capital. Those two principles were related, and they're in fact reflected in the rules of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Those rules state that the Charter of the IMF states that countries are entitled to regulate capital, and the IMF is in fact prohibited by its charter from providing credit, what are called rescue packages these days, to cover capital flight. That's prohibited. The reason for the regulation of capital flow was in part a belief widely held among economists, including Keynes and White, that liberalization of capital, allowing free flow of capital, would undermine free trade. That's a thesis. Like most laws of economics, it's largely speculative, but plausible, and in fact rather well supported by the experience of the last 25 years. I'll come back to that. But the major reason was something which wasn't a thesis, it was a virtual truism, and that is that free movement of capital undermines democracy and essentially dismantles the welfare state, which was very popular, had an enormous amount of support among the public and throughout the world, including the United States. So that couldn't be simply abandoned. In fact, they wanted to strengthen it. The problem is that free flow of capital creates what some international economists call a virtual Senate, meaning financial capital can impose the social policies that it chooses on governments, and it can punish those that deviate by capital flight. That naturally restricts democracy. It undermines the possibility for governments, meaning to the extent that they're democratic people, to participate in socioeconomic planning. And it also undermines efforts to use public resources in what's called inefficiently. That means for people, not for investors. So, for example, efforts to stimulate the economy or to create full employment or to use public resources for health or education or for social welfare, for the environment, for improved working conditions, and other irrational purposes can be terminated and punished by simply flight of capital, which even these days rich and powerful states can't withstand. That's the main reason for the insistence in the Bretton Woods system that capital flight be regulated and controlled, and the prohibition on the IMF to provide credits to cover capital flight. Well, those principles, the second principle, the prohibition on credits for capital flight, that was never taken seriously. The rescue packages, as they're called for the third world, quite substantially do cover capital flight. The third world debt would be very close to eliminated, in some cases completely eliminated, if the societies were able to control their own wealthy people, meaning keep the capital at home and keep the wealthy from robbing the country. In the case of Indonesia, for example, the current IMF rescue package is approximately equal to the estimated wealth of the Suharto family. So there's an easy way to pay off the debt. Just go to the people who've been robbing the country blind ever since they took power in a huge massacre 30 years ago. The Latin American debt, capital flight from wealthy Latin Americans comes pretty close, and sometimes, in fact, exceeds the third world debt, the Latin American debt, which was such a catastrophe since 1982. The way things work, the money is borrowed by the wealthy and by dictators and generals and so on, and then it's paid by the poor. They pay it off, and by Western taxpayers when the debt is socialized. But those aren't economic laws, those are social constructions. And they reflect the failure to take seriously this founding principle of the New World Order. It isn't, incidentally, just the Third World. That began back in the late 1940s with the reconstruction of Europe. There was money in Europe in the hands of wealthy Europeans, but U.S. planners preferred to have wealthy Europeans send their wealth to New York banks with American taxpayers paying for the reconstruction of Europe. There's actually a name for that. It's called the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan, if you look at the figures, and this was well understood at the time, the Marshall Plan funding is approximately the same order and may even have been exceeded by flight of capital from wealthy Europeans to New York banks. So that principle was words. It's never been applied.